right, let's move to our next discussion now. We'll be talking about the NNPC as well as the Federal Account Allocation Committee. There's been lots and lots of disagreements over the past months, and for several weeks now, there has been a stalemate between the Federal Account Allocation Committee and the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation over NNPC's poor remuneration to the Federation account.
Yes, indeed. It started in June when FAAC, in a standoff with NNPC, accused the latter of shortchanging the country by as much as 90 billion naira and mismanaging Nigeria's oil revenue. The FAAC NNPC impasse has degenerated to a level where some state governments who depend on the monthly allocation from the Federation account are unable to pay workers' salaries.
Now, but despite the hardship being faced by states, FAAC is refusing to back down. The committee says it is pushing back against what it termed lack of transparency in the oil sector. Since federal government's denial of the existence of subsidy and its refusal to appropriate funds through the National Assembly to finance cost under recovery, which is just another fancy name for subsidy, states have been bearing the cost as the monies are deducted from their allocations.
Yeah, but the presidency has waded into the matter, and now both FAAC and NNPC are to agree on a revised template for remittance of revenue to the Federation account, as the previous template has been the source of conflict between both bodies. All right, we have joining us in the studio an economist and a member of the editorial board of the Guardian newspapers. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me on board.
Thank you, Abi Adia.
Okay, make us, give us a clear picture, make us understand exactly what this template that government is saying needs to be replaced by a new one. We don't even understand what the old one is, how much more the new one. So maybe briefly, very briefly, you want to explain to us exactly what this is all about.
Thank you. Briefly, we have a petroleum value chain. And basically, as everybody knows, we produce crude.
Yes.
And we export it. And unfortunately, in return, we now import refined products, which is petrol in the main. And what has happened is that that relationship is usually quite clear in terms of what the international price of refined products is and what the landed cost is. And a template has been built up on that based on the various actors within the value chain, and they charge a percentage, and that is what ends up in the petrol station. We are all familiar with whenever there's a dislocation in that chain, and what happens is that it usually results in fuel scarcity and everything. But what has changed from the days of the old fuel subsidy regime was that we now have, most of the players have exited the market because of the high price of refined products and the controlled price of petrol in this country. It does not make economic sense for the private sector actors in the chain to be involved. Because they have departed, we now have a monopoly importer, a sole importer in the case of NNPC. And what that does is that you now get all the issues around the monopoly. It's interesting that the DPR, in this case Department of Petroleum Resources, are actually the ones who are blowing the whistle that what is happening is that the volume of petrol being declared as being imported by the NNPC is not accurate, and the bill is overinflated. Because what has really happened is that the subsidy regime has migrated from the private sector, where we could all see what was happening and the fraud that was associated with that, and has been moved into the NNPC books and accounts. They now call it under recovery, cost under recovery. So basically what has happened is that it is now looks like a benign economic situation. You're accounting in your books. NNPC is accounting, but what needs to happen and what is happening is that NNPC is actually stating how much volume they are importing alone, and based on that declaration, they're making financial claims against the Federation account in terms of how much they remit to FAAC. Now,
in this case, of course, they declared 147 billion.
Yes.
As against 120. That is what
well, I think where you really need to look at it is actually in the fuel consumption.
Okay.
What they state is the fuel consumption, because there are different ways of determining what that metric is. It can be, in layman's terms, the number of trucks that are loaded with petrol and are distributed around the country. That gives you a daily figure, which is what anybody who lives in Apapa is familiar with. There are a lot of trucks there and everything. literally all that petrol has been loaded and going out. So if it is X million, and generally I think the accepted figure is about 35 million.
They are saying it's gone up to 60 million liters.
Which is where this is where the problem comes in. In economics, we have a principle of market pricing. If there is a disconnect between supply and demand, then you are violating an economic fundamental principle. And what happens is that if you insist on a certain price that's not market derived, you're going to have an imbalance and you're going to have dislocations. Now, where all of this is playing out is that the theater has actually shifted. It is now between NNPC, the states, due to the federation account where they share money every month in certain terms, and now even the DPR. If you think about it, for DPR to complain that there's not the lack of transparency in NNPC is, I mean, it's almost farcical if you think about it, because there is no transparency in that whole sector. And we know that, and that's one of the issues. If I solely determine how much I'm importing, I tell you and declare how much I've imported, and I tell you this is what is available, then what will happen is that the chickens have come home to roost, in fact, because the numbers are not adding up. What has been declared as daily consumption, and we've seen this before in the fuel subsidy scam, when it was burst wide open, consumption went from over 60 million liters a day down to 39 million overnight. So where was that phantom 20 million liters? Somebody was getting paid for that 20 million liters a day.
All right. Now, we heard the vice president say at the time that government is not paying subsidy. In fact, it is NNPC that is. So we were asking, who is NNPC, who is government? But if we take away politics and look at it from the economic perspective, paying the oil marketers directly, making an allocation for them directly where they were paid, or, you know, and all of that based on the remittances or what their claims were, and moving into the NNPC to say, okay, NNPC, you'll be responsible now. Is that good for business or bad for business, if we look at it from the economic perspective?
It's extraordinarily bad for business because it's very inefficient. And the bottom line is that we live and die by the international price of crude. We're hit, we enjoy a boom in revenues on that end, but at the same time, we're countered by the price of the imported petrol coming in. So what happens is that supply gap, if you have a fixed price at this end, that is where the distortions are created. There's a cost to those distortions and it has to be paid. What the current system is now, the outcome of it is that it is the shortchanging of the federation account. So whether it's buried in the NNPC books or it's not, either way, that cost is reflected in the shortfall in the federation account. Now, what is happening is that because that is really unearned income for the states in particular, when it's distributed, you get it every month. They're actually coming and they're actually saying that we are significantly being shortchanged right now, and we're actually not going to accept it. And that's why these meetings are getting deadlocked. It's enough and it's significant enough in that shortchange that they'll rather forego whatever it is, because they don't want to set a new baseline where NNPC is allowed to get away with declaring this is what is available. Take it or leave it. We can't show you what's going on in our books over here, but you just have to take our word for it. So the Nigerian Governors Forum is blowing the whistle. DPR is blowing the whistle. The presidency has been forced to wade in. And in all of this, the elephant in the room is the fact that they are pretending there's actually no subsidy. You can call it whatever you want, but it exists, it is there, and it has a real cost to it. And how does it affect the man on the street? Your salaries stop being paid if you're in the public sector in the States, because the allocation is not coming.
With the states now.
It is so fundamental. It's like the laws of gravity. You can't avoid it. So all of this, all the spats, all the disagreements, wading into it, declaring and all of this, it's all based on one thing. If the pricing isn't right, people will not go into that market. If the only player in the market is not transparent in terms of you can't declare what they're doing independently and know what they're doing, then you have this situation. And of course, you also have 2019 coming up.
Of course, absolutely.
So,
now,
that's a big one.
It's a big one.
The FAAC has not been able to hold any meetings this year. It's obviously having an impact on the economy. Governors are not able to pay salaries and what have you. So how do we now get out of this vicious cycle, or what some would call a cul-de-sac? Because it does not seem, according to the NNPC, that the NNPC does not know what the problem is. They are saying this gap, or the reason why we're saying 60 million liters of petrol is being consumed right now. It's because of the cross-border, smuggling and what have you. So they know what the problem is, but they don't seem to have a solution to it.
Because that's not the real problem.
Okay.
Okay. The real problem is the pricing. The pricing
the
is what, yes, the 145.
Naira
If you recall, when it was raised to 145, they had low crude prices.
Yes.
So the refined prices were relatively moderate, which left a lot of headroom available for price modulation, which is moved the price up a little bit as the market dictates.
Which was part of the promise.
Which is part of the promise. And if you recall, they even reduced it at one point slightly from 145 to 143 or something.
Yeah.
The real challenge is that there is not a political will or appetite to actually increase the pricing, because we know what happens, all the screaming and everything. So all of us are actually living in this fantasy land that this is our birthright and that there is a product that we will determine a social pricing for it. And we're not going to accept any increase. And we tenaciously stick to that. What you have is you now have this cost has to find a home where it's going to stay.
When you say we, that's Nigerians actually live in a fool's paradise. That's what you're saying. To believe that 145 is a realistic price. But who do you blame really for this? I mean, when you have refineries that are not working, is that not where the solution really should start from? You know, fix the refineries, and then we can talk about the price of...
You can do that, but if you fix the refineries, the refineries will also be working in a distorted market. They will not be able to get the price that actually allows them to recover their costs. That's why you can't get the private investors in, and that is why you have this challenge. There isn't a political will to raise those prices, but you wait until the Dangote refinery is up and running. That is going to be able to supply the entire country. I assure you at that point you will see some action on the pricing.
Dangote, bringing Dangote in at this point now, government seem to be kind of excited, waiting for Dangote, the almighty Dangote refinery, to come on board. But that's going to also be another monopoly. We just complained of NNPC being a monopoly here, and Nigerians are not benefiting. If we create this, if we look at a scenario where Dangote refinery comes up and it's the biggest or it's the most, #1 refinery, and what kind of scenario are we looking at? Because from NNPC there's a monopoly, from refining there's a monopoly. So where does the Nigerian person stand in all of this?
Well, there's going to be a problem, because this problem is going to persist. Because until we find a way to get the political will to actually go through some sort of deregulation of the pricing, we will always have this distortion as long as the...
But if prices are deregulated, it means it's going to go up.
Yes, and what tends to happen is that more players come into the market. You now get market efficiencies. It's like the price of diesel. It moderates itself right now. And the truth of the matter is that while the number of users may not be as widespread as the users of petrol, petrol has a disproportionate influence, both politically and how people feel about it, because that's really the only product that they sort of see as the byproduct. They forget about all the petrochemicals, the fertilizer and all of that. This is the one that people have zeroed in, and globally within the country is the indicator of our birthright, which is the crude oil, so to speak. But the truth of the matter is, even when that refinery comes on board, there's still going to be a gap. I can assure you that after investing whatever is 10 billion, and it could be anybody, whether it's Dangote or not, whoever does that is going to require market pricing for his recovery.
And Dangote will be producing about 600,000 liters?
Yes,
daily.
and what it means, yes. And so basically, yes, when it comes on stream, and either the subsidy goes directly to Dangote, or he is allowed to charge market pricing.
Whoa.
That is, so you need to figure that out. That is going to be, because what is going to happen now, that creates more political problems. Because not only do you have a monopoly situation, you now have a situation where the average person now views it as we're actually directly subsidizing an individual, which is an unfair indication, a way to look at it. But that's what it becomes, and you can imagine what that has in the point of the critics of the government of the day or whatever. So they're kicking the can down the road, but it's still coming, whether you like it. So there's always something. And literally, we have to modify our behavior, both as consumers and both as policymakers, because the truth is that if at the 145 they had started to modulate, go up to 150, come down to 140, go up, so that you can migrate economic behavior and how people look at it.
But this price modulation and what have you, and these short-term measures, I mean, what would be the more sustainable solution, you know, to this
why
problem? I mean, some have recommended break up the NNPC so that you have more opaqueness in, you know, in that oil giant.
Unbundle it.
Unbundle it, go
yes.
for total deregulation of the downstream and all of that. Will those solve the problem?
NNPC should really not exist in its current form. It shouldn't. It is what it's doing at. It is not efficient. It's not effective. It's not transparent, and it is so critical to the economy that you cannot afford to have that sort of systemic dislocation and distortion going out into your economy, because it cascades into everything we're doing. And honestly, if you had a way, the Petroleum Industry Governance Bill, that's one of the reasons why it's taken so long, and everything, the unbundling, the restructuring, but it's going to require a lot of political will. And whether you like it or not, NNPC serves a lot of vested interests. That's not necessarily, but it is. And
exactly, because that's what I wanted to ask, how challenging would it be? Because when it comes to even within NNPC itself, when you have the unions there, some of these unions can hold the country to a ransom. We have seen that before.
Absolutely, and the truth of the matter is that the unions, if you ask me, they don't actually act in their best self-interest. Certainly not from a long-term sustainable point of view. And eventually what tends to happen is you make yourself irrelevant, or you make people less sympathetic to you. But I don't think people move lockstep with the unions, because over time what has happened is that the viewpoint of how we look at them has changed. They just have just as many distortions as the rest of everybody else. They act in their self-interest even when it's irrational behavior. And that becomes glaring even to somebody who is not educated or who is not exposed to something. You know when your neighbor is not acting in their self-interest. You know, so because their own behavior is illogical in terms of resistance and opposition to what is glaring and what is obvious, it marginalizes them and the voice of reason and what it is. And so even their threats of whatever, it don't get as much traction as they used to. And so
what would it look like if NNPC is sold to the public, where maybe the stock exchange and Nigerians buy into it, and it's solely owned by Nigeria, or Nigerians, sorry? What would it look like?
And to be run as a private sector organization?
Yes, exactly.
Well, it'll certainly become more effective, because there's so much headroom for it to move up on. It's really severely underperforming, and it's not alone in that, in terms of, so just merely selling it does not mean, because if you think about it, it goes down to some of the fundamentals, some of the things that are in the Constitution, the ownership of the resources, and you know, everything going into the Federation account and everything. So where does NNPC now fit into that? It's not something you can just sell off overnight, in my estimation, which is why I come down to some of the things is that you need to be incremental in your approach to how you do these things.
Should be a gradual
yes,
process.
And one of the things to do is, if NNPC was operating, because we've heard this before, we're commercializing NNPC, they're going to operate like a commercial with all the, but the truth of the matter is that as long as they are backed and 100% owned by the government, who can effectively write a blank check to them or not hold them to account, as the case may be, they have so much resources under their control that those resources equate into political power, political influence, and they can protect themselves, because they can deliver those resources for uses that are below the line, shall we say.
Okay, so let's look at another dimension. This whole debate about the NNPC not remitting into the TSA, and then you have, of course, the banks. Some who are observing this are saying, if you pull out NNPC's funds from the banks, you might have a real problem on your hands, because the banks will be affected. They are still, you know, to a very large extent, holding on to, you know, these funds. That's keeping them afloat, more or less.
I think probably those are not the only funds that are being held outside the system. The way the system works is that it is so vast and everything. We occasionally get to hear about some areas where some things were kept out of the TSA through some arcane regulation, or to somebody making a self-determination that his organization is actually exempt from the TSA. And then when they are asked and they're called to order, they whip out an approval letter from somebody from much higher up and say that, yes, we did this. So these are all the things that will continue to occur. I agree that, yes, you could move that funds out of it and move it into, but the question is, even if it's within the TSA, is it being judiciously utilized? Is it being well used, and all of these things? This matters, because it's like the reserves or whatever it is you want to call it. The mere fact is there. if it's not acting or being used or put to good use and effective use, it doesn't make any difference. So there's no point banding. It could be 200 billion reserves. But the fact is that if we're not using it, it's not helping the economy or whatever. I just can't sit at home and marvel at the size of my individual bank account and keep telling my children how big it is and everything. Meanwhile, there's no food in the house and there's no petrol in the car and all of that.
It's almost looking static now. About $47 billion, talking about the external
foreign reserve.
Reserves and all that. But let me ask you a question that some experts have asked. That does Nigeria really know how much crude oil it produces every day? How much more what it consumes?
We don't know either.
Do we really know?
We don't know each of those figures. Nobody can say this is the accurate figure and it will withstand intense scrutiny. So we're unique in that situation. We're almost like a company who doesn't know what it produces in raw material.
To keep it that way?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Anybody tells you different, they're not telling you the truth. It serves a lot of purposes when you don't have full transparency, because then the resources you're putting in and what you're sending out, if both are not quite clear, if there's an X factor of both of them, it leaves room for arbitrage, for rent seeking, for whatever it is, the things that happen around government that we all know but would like to see less of. So that is it's always an available and it's a very attractive option. You take it out of the table, it becomes transparent with complete scrutiny and independence, people could look into it, then all of a sudden you don't have as many powers of patronage as you would have liked to have. So
the states are at the receiving end as it is right now. What is their fate when it comes to, because this issue is still on, and some of the solutions we have talked about here are kind of or somewhat medium to long-term solutions. What do states do now? What's their fate now in the immediate? Because the FAAC meeting has been reconvened and shifted and all of that for about 5 times now.
I think what has happened is that it is the quantum of the dislocation that's actually the problem for the states. They recognize that if they accept what is happening before them and they increasingly get shortchanged, they're going to be in problem. Because once they accept that NNPC can be the sole determinant of what is available to the Federation account, then that number is probably likely to shrink. And they don't want to set that as a baseline and a template going forward. So they're screaming and they are willing to rock the system systemically, so to speak, and it's creating serious challenges and it'll cascade into political problems. And when that happens, that is why you're seeing the major players, the presidency, coming into it and saying, gentlemen, ladies, we have to sort this out. They would prefer to sort it out in the back room, but a lot of it is in the public glare because people have actually gone public on this. Usually, these are the sort of disagreements that are usually politically taken care of by the agencies talking to themselves. Basically, maybe the presidency or whoever calling them in and sit down and say, gentlemen, ladies, sort this out.
Right. Abi Ayida, economist and member editorial board of The Guardian. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
A pleasure as always. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for coming.
Okay.